Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two to let all the participants join in. I think we can start. It looks like we've got most of the attendees here. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Elms. I'm the Client Relations Manager for the trades programs across Atlantic Canada. And I'm joined today by Raman Kabra, General Counsel from RMA, who's spearheading the trade programs for our alliance across Canada. And today's really about answering some of the questions regarding the legal and procurement messaging from our trade programs. And I've been asked by a lot of the members to have one of these webinars. We're really excited about this. And we're so glad that Raman could join us today to help talk a little bit more and put a little bit more meat on the bones for the programs. And as always, there's a chat function at the end of that you can ask your questions. We encourage you to put your hand up or ask it in the chat room. And without further ado, we're going to move forward with that. And I'll be following up with some updates afterwards on the trade programs. So Raman, good morning.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everyone. And I see, hi, Donna. My name is Raman Kabra, and Tim mentioned I'm the General Counsel at RMA. What we're going to talk about a little bit today is, it's regarding procurement in Canada and the obligations that you as representatives for your respective municipalities, as well as the buying group side of things are, required to comply with. Now, that's me. I'm always happy to touch base with our friends on the East Coast. I went to law school at Dalhousie in Halifax, and I articled out there. So it's always nice to touch base with the communities out there. Now, as Tim mentioned, with our alliance, it spreads across Canada. So that's our reach, and we have partnerships across the country with various regional municipal groups. And so we're educating each other and learning a bit about trade in the various jurisdictions. Now, when we're talking about domestic trade in Canada, it is governed at various levels. So there's the local legislation, often that's in the form of directives and policies that provide guidance to municipalities. Then there are the regional agreements that set out the various partnerships that are seeking to remove barriers to trade within specific regions. And the agreement that we're going to focus on today is the national agreement, and that's the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. We refer to it as a new agreement. It came into effect, in 2017, but it is really the national agreement that governs trade within Canada. When we're looking at the regional agreements, I just want to reference the Atlantic Procurement Agreement. Out here out west, we have the NWPTA. So when you're looking at procurement, it's really important to remember that these agreements are overlapping at the national and regional levels. So when you're engaging in procurement, it's important to ensure that you're considering all different levels. The legislation, grows and evolves over time. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're engaged in procurement for your municipalities. Now, when we're talking about the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, what's the big deal? Well, it replaced the Agreement on Internal Trade, which was the first pan-Canadian agreement that sought to eliminate barriers to the free movement of persons, goods, services, and investments within Canada. So it was a really great piece of legislation in theory, but not so much in practice. And so in July of 2017, the Agreement on Internal Trade was replaced by the CFTA. It's no longer in effect. There's definitely still some provisions with respect to enforcement that are still being used as various enforcement provisions, and parts of the CFTA continue to come into effect. But what the CFTA aimed to do is pick off where the Agreement on Internal Trade left off. And what it did is it brings Canadian jurisdictions in line with other regional agreements, like the more modern agreements, such as the Atlantic Cooperation Agreement, as well as the NWPTA. And what it is it's a clear and comprehensive framework for internal trade in Canada. So there's a clear set of trade rules that govern what we do on the government procurement side. And the goal here is just to make it easier for businesses and investors and workers to have easier and increased access to Canada-wide markets and opportunities. Now, the signatories for the Canadian Free Trade Agreement is the federal government and the provinces and territories. So as the province is the party to the CFTA, each province is then responsible to ensure compliance with the CFTA by its regional, local, and district forms of government. So the way that we're looking at it, it's a good way to look at it as just an expansion of regional trends. The regional trends that we're seeing at the procurement level is, the trends of transparency and non-discrimination, within the rest of the country. So another thing is that with the CFTA, the changes that we saw were intended to align with international agreements. So CETA, for instance, it's very similar in its language and obligations. So CETA is referring to the Canada-European Trade Agreement, as well as other modern international treaties. The CFTA also regulates more vast sectors of the Canadian economy. And so there's just a little bit more agreement and commitment from the jurisdictions with respect to which sectors that this agreement applies to. And it's become more strict in its approach compared to the Agreement on Internal Trade. There's a lot of wiggle room and exceptions in the Agreement on Internal Trade. So the CFTA just generally has more agreement on its goals, the commitment from the parties, and it is more specific or rigid in its approach. Another thing is that the CFTA clearly outlines and considers buying groups and group purchasing, whereas we didn't see that before in the national legislation. So what the CFTA does is it sets out rules for government procurement for a governmental purpose of a good or service that's not intended to be resold by any contractual means. So that can include leases or rentals with or without the option to buy for the values which exceed certain thresholds. So with the CFTA for goods and services, the threshold value is now $105,700. And for construction, that's $264,200. It's always important to note that with the regional agreements and your local agreements, the threshold amounts are likely lower. So you're hitting those threshold amounts, calling for an open procurement quite quicker and more easily than you would under the Canadian legislation. But the difference here is when you're estimating valuation, you need to look at the total procurement value to be in line with the CFTA. So that's really relevant for groups like RMA, as well as our Atlantic partners, because we're not looking at individual members, individual procurement, but we're looking at the potential total procurement value. So the way that we operate our groups is to assume that we're going to be hitting those threshold amounts. And so our opportunities are open and transparent, whether or not we ultimately hit those threshold amounts. Given our size and reach, again, we assume that we're going to hit those amounts. But because our programs are voluntary, we in no way guarantee volumes or numbers for vendors at all. Also, when you're looking at valuation, we'll talk about this a little bit later, you're considering the total procurement value over a number of years. So it's not just specific to a 1-year term. And positive obligations on buying groups. As I mentioned before, there wasn't enough or a ton of guidance on how the trade legislation was going to impact group procurement or buying groups. So, the language was quite permissive before. So now with the CFTA, there's provisions that expressly clarify buying group procedures for the municipalities as well as for the groups themselves. Now, when we're talking about a buying group, we're talking about a group of 2 or more members that's combining the purchasing requirements and activities of the members of its group into one joint procurement process. So this is specifically allowed and permitted in the national legislation. So that can include cooperative arrangements and more formal corporate arrangements. But when there's, it could also consist of a variety of entities. But when you're looking at government procurement, regardless of the makeup of the group, these rules get triggered. And so for many of the procurement activities that we're conducting, within our regional associations, we'd be considered buying groups for the purpose of the CFTA, and that's the legislation that we fall under and do comply with through our processes. Now, the CFTA, as I mentioned, sets out specific positive obligations with its procurement rules. So the first here, it's directly pulled from the legislation, this text, but it's noted that a procuring entity, so your municipalities, shall ensure that any procurement conducted through a buying group is carried out in a manner that's consistent with the general procurement rules of government procurement. So, there's a requirement to do your due diligence when participating in a buying group to ensure that that there's confidence in the processes of that buying group. Now, with respect to the buying group, a buying group is required to publish a notice for each procurement. That notice is required to list all participating procuring entities, as well as the potential for other procuring entities to participate in the procurement after the instrument is initially put in place. And again, this is for our members. A procuring entity shall publish a notice of its participation with the buying group at least annually on one of the tendering websites or systems designated by the province. So that notice the purpose of that notice is to direct potential suppliers to the buying group tender notices website if it is different from the province's tendering website or systems. That's something that's new. You might hear about that from Tim, and that is a requirement. So, if you're intending to participate in the processes within your regional group, you are required to post a notice of participation or a notice of intention, as we often refer to it, on your provincial tendering website. And I understand that in the Atlantic provinces, each province has its own. So it's important to ensure that you do that posting. Now, this is just some sample text, and Tim can definitely provide you with some that's specific to your regional organization. But this is text that we've vetted through various provincial organizations. So it's just, it's a simple posting indicating the timeline within a 1-year period that the participating entity intends to be a part of the buying group. It's also really important, I've referenced Merck's because it's one of the more national tendering websites, but of course, depending on where you are, you will be referencing your local procurement websites. We also just recommend inserting a link to the local group so that different opportunities and things won't be missed, and it's clear where to go for opportunities. Now, there's also this note within the legislation. So where a procuring entity has little or no control over the procurement process, it's not required to ensure that the procurement is consistent with the chapter of the legislation. So what that really means is that those obligations then fall on the buying group to ensure that procurement is being consistent within group procurement rules. And so that's something that we take very seriously, and we work really hard on to ensure that we are complying. So when we're talking about the rules, what are they? They're the same rules that are going to be applicable to you. So these are the themes that we see within trade legislation across the country. It's open, transparent, and non-discriminatory access to covered procurement by its procuring entities. So when we're talking about no favoritism, that's referring to treatment that's no less favorable than the best treatment that you would accord to local goods and services and to local suppliers. And then when we're looking at no avoidance or no circumventing, what that means is, you're prohibited from preparing or designing or otherwise structuring a procurement or dividing procurement requirements in order to avoid the obligations of the CFTA. So, that could be selecting a valuation method that brings you under the threshold to try to avoid the obligations, dividing quantities of goods and services that may be required to be procured, diverting funds to entities that aren't covered by the CFTA, or other buying groups that are intended to avoid the obligations of the procurement rules. As well, not using options or canceling procurements or setting it up so that you're trying to circumvent the obligations within this legislation. It's also important to note that there's a number of exempted procurements for each province, as well as generally within this legislation. So on a general level, any form of financial assistance, procurement of financial services, health and social services, those types of things are exempted procurements. But it is really important to note too that there's certain existing measures for each province. So when you are engaged in procurement for your respective entities, take a look at the schedules within the legislation. Some governments have taken an approach to remove some of these exceptions, and we saw that in Alberta. We had a government change to lift some of those exceptions to trade, but it definitely is important to take a look to see which might be applicable to you. So when we're talking about tender notices, we often refer to them as RFPs, but the requirements are very clear. Obviously, the name and address of the procuring entity. You need to provide a description of the procurement, as well as describing the nature and quantity of goods and services that are going to be procured. The evaluation criteria is something that's huge in this area. So if you need to include methods of weighing if that's the case. If price is your sole criteria, that needs to be noted as well. Any sort of supplier requirements need to be noted within the RFP notice. It's important to note that it's explicit in the legislation that where there are technical specifications, they should be used not to obstruct trade, but set out sort of those technical specifications in terms of performance and function, rather than a specific design or characteristics unless absolutely required. And we see that often with respect to preference for brands. That's something that this legislation wants to clearly note, that just preference for a specific brand is not an appropriate technical specification. Of course, deadlines are important as well. When you're posting an RFP or a tender, it's important to note that the legislation just calls for a reasonable amount of time. But if you take a look at the international trade legislation, which has higher thresholds, it's, I believe, 40 days. And that also depends. So definitely take a look at the requirements and ensure that you're posting for a reasonable amount of time. A negotiation allowance. This is something that's new as well. So if you're intending or wanting to be able to negotiate with suppliers, it needs to be stipulated within your tender notice. Or if there's no clearly advantageous tender in response to your opening, then you can also engage in negotiations. A list of participants and potential for expanded procurement. So as a buying group, that's something that we do. We attach spreadsheets with existing members of our partners, as well as note that there's a potential for that membership to change. So we want to be really clear on, which government entities might be impacted by this RFP, so that suppliers know whether or not it's valuable for them to respond. When we're talking about preference for local suppliers, the legislation is really clear on that too. There can't be a preference for local suppliers, but you can require that a supplier or an investor have a local agent or address for service. You can require them to post a bond or other financial security, so that there is confidence that you're going to get and be able to procure the goods and services that you do need. Modifications and clarifications. Often once a posting is up, there's a number of questions that municipalities will receive with respect to that posting. Our recommendation is most of the answers to those questions are going to be relevant to all suppliers. So the legislation requires that you inform all suppliers. So often what we recommend and what we do in our processes is post an addendum that notes and clarifies any sort of information. So you just want to make sure that any sort of information that's being provided once there is an RFP open, that there's not sort of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination there. Oftentimes, some of the questions will result in consideration on our end, and we will extend dates for submission where it's appropriate, if an RFP wasn't reasonably clear. Now, time periods, again, we talked about the reasonable time period. So what you want to consider is the nature and complexity of what you're seeking. In the case of construction, often you want to look at the extent of subcontracting that may be anticipated. And there's also, reference to providing enough time for transmitting tender documentation by non-electronic means. So just allowing for snail mail or drop-offs in person. Sometimes you want to open your process up a little bit longer. What we've started to do is note a preference or a requirement that submissions be made electronically. So that's something that you could do as well, but it's important to note that in your documentation from the get-go. And we talked a bit about negotiations. We want to clearly note that in the RFP. It can also be in the case where there's no obviously advantageous response. Any sort of eliminations that you're doing when there are negotiations need to be in accordance with the criteria. So you want to be really careful with your evaluation criteria about what's absolutely required. So use of language like shall or must, those kind of establish absolute requirements. And so eliminations need to be conducted in accordance with that criteria. So definitely we always recommend taking a look to make sure that when you're setting up your RFPs that the evaluation criteria is clear and that you're setting up requirements that are necessary. You don't want to you don't want to preclude certain suppliers from minor errors, but some things might be more important than others. So definitely take a look at that. And then when you're setting up negotiations, it needs to be noted whether that's concurrent or consecutive. So negotiating at the same time with all parties or one at a time, giving opportunity for potential vendors to respond. And again, with negotiations, the same rules apply. No unfairness, no discrimination, no providing information that would give a specific supplier the upper hand in negotiations as well. Standing offers. That's something that's clearly permitted in the legislation, and that's how we tend to set up our offerings. When you are trying to set up a standing offer, it needs to be noted clearly, at the start of the competitive process that you're looking to establish a standing arrangement. And the key part of that is establishing how call-ups, orders, that sort of thing are going to be made. So for us, again, we don't guarantee any certain value amounts or participation of our members. It's a voluntary program. So in our RFP documentation, we tend to note that that will be at the discretion of our members and our potential future members. Limited tendering is something we hear about a lot. So, that can be referred to as direct sourcing or sole sourcing. There is an ability to do that. Typically that's, the one reason for that is if you get no tender responses, you can go to a single source, as well as for unforeseen or emergent circumstances. So in Alberta, we saw this recently with respect to a cyber breach with one of our members. There wasn't an opportunity to put out a tender notice for a reasonable amount of time that wouldn't have caused a ton of damage. So, that's a potential emergency circumstance. Also, for IT procurements, there's a new exception that accommodates that. So it says, it notes that if there's additional goods and services that were not included in the initial competitive process, you're able to kind of, engage in this direct sourcing. And that's really acknowledging that, economic or technical reasons, switching suppliers when there's a change in services required would cost, municipalities significant inconvenience and a duplication of costs. So those are kind of instances where limited tendering is available. It also notes that instances of collusion is a new exception as well, and an opportunity for limited tendering. So if bids in a procurement process are looking collusive, you may choose to engage in a direct award. And again, exceptions can vary from region to region, so definitely check the schedules within your local and regional legislation, as well as under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Now, as a buying group, we assume we're going to hit the threshold valuation fairly easily. So we generally will avoid, and by generally, I mean we specifically will avoid limited tendering situations within our group. Awards. So tenders need to be awarded within 72 days of the closing date. The most advantageous tender needs to be selected. Of course, unless it's not in the public interest. So, there are exclusions permitted there, in cases of vendors with bankruptcy, false declarations, persistent deficiencies in performance, serious crime, that sort of thing. But other than that, you want to look at your evaluation criteria and award based on, the most advantageous response. You're also able to verify anything that might be abnormally low. So if there's an abnormally low response, you are able to verify that response to ensure that you're not awarding to an entity that's going to jack up the prices later on. With respect to awards, same rules apply. You need to be really transparent. Posting the award is important. if a vendor or supplier requires a response in writing, you are required to provide that. And you are required to provide reasons if that's requested by an unsuccessful party. Vendor debriefs are something that's new under the national legislation. So if they are requested, you are required to provide a debrief to a vendor. So that's really important, again, like looking at your evaluation criteria and ensuring that you are following that. Because of the fact that there is this open process involved, you may be required to back up your reasons for an award. Now, here are some examples of inconsistent actions with the legislation. Of course, according to preference for local goods, services, or suppliers is a main one. Scheduling events in a tendering process in order to prevent certain suppliers from submitting their responses. Using price discounts or preferential margins in order to favor certain suppliers. We had a question come up, and it was a good question. Often our models for our successful vendors will include a price discount. And that's part of our evaluation criteria. We clearly note that, and we clearly have evaluation formulas in place. So when we are asking for discounts off list, that's really important sometimes with some certain commodities where pricing may change over the term of the contract. That's not what that's referring to here. This is, just basically giving an edge to a specific supplier, on the front end here. Limiting participation to only suppliers that have been awarded one or more contracts in the past. That's something that's new, and that was in response to some challenges by vendors where procuring entities were limiting to vendors they knew. Requiring prior experience, that's something that's not permitted unless it's essential to meet the requirements of the procurement. So, with respect to goods, requiring sort of a prior experience, that's inconsistent. Of course, with services, that's going to be more important, having that, proven track record, but it is important to note that that's something that's specifically noted within the legislation. We talked about providing information as an advantage for one vendor or supplier over another. That's a clear inconsistent action, and as well as creating unnecessary obstacles to participation in the procurement. Now, there is potential for change in how the Canadian Free Trade Agreement will be interpreted in the future. There is a specific call within the legislation for provinces to engage in exploratory discussions and negotiations with relevant ministries and stakeholders. So the application may ultimately, the application of the rules may extend to industries that are currently not within covered procurement under the legislation. In Alberta, these discussions haven't occurred yet. So, check with your local governments to see if there's any changes or specific regional sort of discussions about inclusion of these rules. Based on what I've seen to date, there's nothing significant to note, but we definitely will keep our partners informed of any changes that we do hear of. Creation of a roster of panelists, that's something with respect to enforcement. Again, provinces are enforcing the rules of trade legislation, so it does vary from province to province a bit on interpretation and the level of enforcement there. So certainly as CETA obligations continue to come into place, the federal government is putting pressure on provinces to ensure that they're meeting these sort of goalposts with respect to the CFTA as well. An electronic SPA, that's something that the federal government is required to establish. SPA refers to a single point of access. And so that again, that's noted in the CFTA, and there's a requirement that under CETA, the international trade agreement with Europe, that a single point of access be established by September of 2022. So, you may be hearing about that a bit. The goal there is to have a single point of access when opportunities hit certain thresholds. Under CETA, the thresholds are much higher, but it is something to keep in mind. From what we're seeing, what I'm hearing, from our discussions with regional governments, is that likely what's going to happen is that your local portals will feed into this single point of access. So we're waiting to hear more about that. And of course, when there's changes in government and policy, there'll be necessary, changes to your schedules and things. So keep an eye on that. We certainly do. And experience as challenges come up, processes change, requirements change, expectations change. So that's definitely something that we'll be seeing in this realm for sure. So when I'm giving general tips, I say, don't assume that your current practices are compliant. When we started looking at our processes here at the RMA, there was a number of contracts and agreements that have been grandfathered in for years and years. So, it was important for us to take a look at all of our agreements and see what required revamping and what required that open procurement process. I always say stick to the lower threshold levels when you're considering compliance. So regionally, there's typically lower threshold amounts for government procurement. And so, I always say operate at those lower amounts to ensure that you're being compliant at the various levels of legislation. Use caution when you're applying any of the exceptions. Make sure that they apply. And when you're establishing any sort of conditions for participation in a procurement, keep that no favoritism and non-discrimination provisions in mind. So there's definitely a lot to consider on the municipal procurement side. And so that's something that we spend a lot of time on at RMA and with our respective partners as well in the Alliance across the country. So we know that it's time and resource consuming to put out open procurements, all the time. So we try to make sure that we're saving you that time and those resources. We review trade legislation and guides across Canada. We've had a national review conducted by a national law firm out of Ontario, where we compare the different legislation in different regions to ensure that we're advising our membership accordingly. We meet with officials to review the procedures and processes to ensure that we're compliant. One example is, with respect to Service New Brunswick. The requirement in New Brunswick was that any sort of buying group gets approved from the provincial body. And so we engaged with discussions with Service New Brunswick, and we've received that seal of approval that our buying group processes are compliant within New Brunswick. So that's a nice clear example of confidence in our programs and the compliance of our programs. And updating RFP templates and contracts. If you take a look at some of the RFPs that we are posting recently, they're fairly detailed and really stringent in requirements. And so that comes with change and challenges. And we continue to revamp our RFP and contracts so that our membership feels confident in our processes. So when we're looking at our growth and the changes in our processes over time, of course, our reach is significant. Because of that, there's added responsibility to ensure that our members across the country are complying with the rules of procurement. So of course we need to adapt to follow local and regional legislation and respond accordingly. Some of our vendors have commented that, our processes are really onerous now, but that's something that we found to be a necessary evolution as our groups continue to partner and grow. We want to be able to remove any ambiguity from our RFP documents and our contracts, and just ensure that compliance side is that we're being really strong with our compliance. Environment plays a huge role with respect to the revisions that we make over time. It definitely is a balance, trying to ensure market access for our vendors and also, procuring the best products, services at the best pricing for our members. Moved ahead here. Over the past few years, most governments had been working to reduce barriers to internal trade. And then now, in the face of this pandemic and challenges in various economies across the country, there's been whispers about pulling back on some of these commitments and trying to focus on local. There was a meeting of senior officials in September regarding the CFTA commitments, and they did reaffirm provincial commitment in the reduction of barriers. So that's important to note as well. And the government officials also noted the importance of a healthy regulatory environment as being a significant part of our economic recovery. But that the environment feeds into our processes, and we're trying to balance all of these competing sort of competing interests as we're setting up our programs and ensuring that we're being compliant. Now, other challenges that we receive, our program is voluntary. We can't and don't guarantee any sort of volumes to vendors. So it is quite a bit of work when you're having a voluntary program to do and conduct these processes. But it's something that we take very seriously. But it's something that requires education across the country with respect to requirements. It really varies from region to region, the familiarity with trade legislation, as well as the, interest in compliance. It really, from what I've seen in the last 4 years, varies, from province to province, from municipality to municipality. So that's definitely been a challenge. We're lucky to have, our partners and, members on, in Atlantic Canada educating as well, and Tim does a great job. So if you ever have any questions, he's really open to, if he doesn't have the answers, he certainly looks and he'll get back to you on that. And even though we've had these comments from vendors about our processes, what we've realized is we've received some challenges from vendors. And the best way to respond to challenges is just simply providing our documents. We had a complaint from a disgruntled vendor, and we provided our documents to the provincial body, and that was the end of that. The complaint didn't proceed to the next level. So, we're confident in our process and the benefits of our program, and, we are setting out secure contracts for our members. Again, when we're talking about voluntary programs, you're likely seeing or hearing about more disgruntled vendors going directly, they're likely going directly to you in an effort to circumvent the procurement rules, in the case where perhaps they didn't respond to an open tender and trying to do one-off contracts. If that's something that you're experiencing, please bring this to us. We can continue to work on educating vendors as well with respect to the rules of compliance. And, we are really confident in our processes, as I've mentioned. We definitely believe that strong processes result in strong relationships. So though there's changes in this field all the time, and I'm sure there's going to continue to be as we grow and evolve as partners across the country. These are necessary processes, and even though some requirements may seem insignificant and tedious, we at RMA and with our partners across the country want to do what we can to support our members. We want to be able to manage compliance on your behalf, and we want you to be confident that we are handling that in an appropriate way on your behalf. So again, just a little example of our reach. We have a couple of areas we're still trying to tackle, but certainly we are proud of our reach and the significant buying power that affords, and the pricing and value that we're able to bring through our programs. So I hope that this has been helpful in understanding the kind of procedures and processes and legislation that we are required to comply with, and hopefully you've learned something today. But if you have any questions, I'll try my best to answer them. And Tim's back on, and I'm sure he's happy to answer any questions you might have as well.
Thanks so much, Roman. Honestly, it's just so great to get the wealth of experience. And I'm talking to the members and talking about how great the programs are, but it's so great to know that there's a team of legal expertise that's working through the programs and following the compliances across Canada, which is great. Well, we're gonna wait for some questions to come in, Roman, and they're gonna be put into the chat room, or you can raise your hand, whichever works best for you. While we wait, I'm going to actually just share a quick screen. I know some of you have seen this page before, and it's really what sums up the programs in a nutshell, traditional versus cooperative purchasing, and going back on what Roman's been talking to us about identifying the need and researching the options. The rest of the points, those blue numbers, the 3 to 9, have been processed, or the tendering process has been done on your behalf. So really, we have created these trade programs across Canada that help save time and money for suppliers and our members. And so I'm really happy that you were able to come on today and talk about this, because we often hear, oh, this sounds too good to be true. And in fact, it's great to hear a little bit more info on that. So I do think there's a question that's come in, and it's a quite easy one right here. I'm sure you've answered the question. Will there be a copy of the slides and also the recorded meeting available to us? Absolutely. This has been recorded, and we're going to post this so you can share the link, as well as with our contacts that you can reach out to both myself and to Roman with any additional questions. There was a question that was answered here as well. Question that was asked. Hi everyone. Roman mentioned working with Service New Brunswick to ensure comfort and understanding of your thoroughness of the process. Do we have anything underway with the province of Nova Scotia? I can answer this, and Roman, you can answer as well. We've actually are in talks with all the provinces in across Canada, but specifically in Nova Scotia. There's been quotes that have been made through our program. Yes, all the legal processes have been met in order to be within in the province, and I'm sure, Roman, you can attest to that. But yeah, we're working with all the Atlantic provinces, and PEI, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia collectively, and to really make sure that they are aware of the program. And they have also reached out in many cases to us with quotes through our program. So Roman, I'll let you talk a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, like reaching out for quotes, is a fairly clear indicator of the legitimacy of our processes. The sign off from Service was something that's required within Service New Brunswick, is something that's required within their local legislation. Typically, we don't get letters from each province, indicating compliance unless that is the requirement for us to be there. But certainly, we meet with provincial officials all the time. I know Tim talks to the officials over there in Nova Scotia a lot. And certainly if there were ever any questions, or if any provincial authorities want to meet with me, I'm really open to that. We do that, oftentimes actually we've had discussions in various provinces where the familiarity, even at the provincial level, we're playing catch up, right, with the legislation. Personally, I don't feel that the federal government did a great job in educating on these requirements. So sometimes Tim's out there for certain municipalities, and they say, what open procurement, right? Like this is just not the way we've done things. So oftentimes, we found ourselves providing education at that provincial level as well. So, if you have, any contacts or anything that might want to reach out within Nova Scotia, I'm happy to speak to them, and I know Tim's always available as well.
It's a really exciting time right now because it is such a new concept coming in, and it was exciting for New Brunswick to have a written documentation of that. Just so everybody knows, things are evolving so fast with the programs and the offering. And we do have some updates on the approved vendor list, and I'd be happy to send out the list for everyone. We update that on a monthly basis. We've got EV charging stations vendor that's currently been approved, as well as that's electronic vehicle charging stations, and a few suppliers for skate parks that have come on board for this month, as well as we've got a brand new aggregates program that's offering a huge range of products, including gravel, sand, clay, and other aggregated related materials. And then most recently, I know it's very, very exciting, is the Waterworks program with the following approved vendors: Iconics, MCO Corporation, 11X, and Computrol. And we'll have more information that's actually launching this month, which is very exciting. And it's constantly evolving with over 44 tabs through our capital purchasing programs for the approved vendors, and hundreds of approved vendors here locally, as well as the programs that we're developing to make your workload easier, and as mentioned, that it's all compliant and transparent as well. So I'm here to help answer any other questions. I don't see anything coming through, Ron.
You made a good point there that I just want to touch on a little bit. Because of our size, oftentimes our agreements are, at the manufacturing level, or so we have these agreements, but those benefits trickle down to local distributors as well. So they're often being the boots on the ground and actually enforcing some of these agreements. So if there's a concern there that local vendors are missing out, like oftentimes, for instance, with our tire program, local vendors participating with Michelin, our contract might be with Michelin tires, but the local vendors there are who are participants are able to give effect to those contracts. So there is that local element there, especially when when the reach does get bigger. Oftentimes, the concern is that smaller mom and pop shops type things won't be able to respond just simply because of the volume and the cost associated with it. But that's something that local vendors have indicated that has been beneficial for them, is knowing that municipalities have these approved contracts, and then they can then pass that pricing along through these contracts that they might not be able to put out on their own.
Absolutely, it's mutually beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hold on for another minute or two. I don't see any other questions coming through. However, our contacts will be made available to you if you want to follow up. If you want to have any more questions about next steps, feel free to reach out. It's all available on the respective association sites. It's really quite simple. You're already active members, so just reach out, and there's a few steps with the notice of intent, the opt-in form, to make sure that you have everything in place for accounting purposes. And again, you have my contact. Reach out with any questions, and I can be happily available to answer them or look for the answers for them. Thanks again, Roman, for your help today. It was really informative. So.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. Have a great day. Happy, may the 4th be with you. Take care.